Greetings, and welcome to our video, Moses the Magician, exploring the mystique of Gurdjieff, Moses, Egypt, and the wisdom of a lost great civilization. Today we're going to venture on a unique exploration, viewing the enigma of Moses and ancient Egypt through the lens of the fourth way. We're set to traverse beyond the realms of known history, revealing the profound esoteric depths of one of spirituality's most intriguing figures in Moses. In this video, we'll be analyzing the life and magic of Moses. But in order to do that, we have to really understand the magic of Egypt first. And there's one large mystery at the heart of this that historians are still baffled by, and no definitive solution has ever really been proposed. And that's the fact that the civilization of Egypt seems to have emerged all at once and fully formed out of nowhere. And it really makes no historical sense because you go from this primitive civilization that has no writings, the pottery doesn't have any writing on it, and it's very primitive. It doesn't just improve slowly, it explodes out of nowhere, and civilization just appears fully formed. And suddenly there's a monarchy, and there's laws, and there's writing, and there's these very complex hieroglyphs. They don't really know exactly what happened. There's a lot of theories, of course, and we're going to go into a couple of them. But normally what happens in a civilization is you go through a stage of learning, and it's slow and it's painful, and then you slowly get better, and you can see evidence of the writing, the papyrus scrolls, the pottery we find will have writing on it. One thing that would make it make sense would be the fact that a third civilization we don't know about came in and established a civilization in Egypt. And that's why it exploded very quickly, but then it also kind of dissipated relatively quickly as well. And that's the other thing that makes this story pretty interesting is Egypt explodes into this creative phase, but then it peaks, and then the great works start dwindling. And I want to provide some evidence directly from Egyptologists, and I'll be quoting here from a couple of Egyptologists to give you a sense of what they think about Egypt and where it originated. And I'll be quoting here from Professor Walter Emery, who is the Edwards Professor of Egyptology at the University of London. And he says that a period of approximately 3,400 years before Christ, a great change took place in Egypt, and the country passed rapidly from a state of Neolithic culture with a complex tribal character to one of a well-organized monarchy. At the same time, the art of writing appears, monumental architecture, the arts and crafts developed to an astonishing degree, and all the evidence points to the existence of a luxurious civilization. All this was achieved within a comparatively short period of time, for there appears to be little or no background to these developments in writing or architecture in the archaeological evidence. Now, one explanation that others have given is, okay, perhaps civilization did appear suddenly in Egypt, but maybe it came from one of their neighbors like Mesopotamia or somewhere else around that region. But Professor Emery has also heard that explanation, and he doesn't buy it. Here's an additional quote. He says that the impression we get is of an indirect connection, and perhaps the existence of a third party whose influence spread to both the Euphrates and the Nile. Modern scholars have tended to ignore the possibility of immigration to both regions from some hypothetical and as yet undiscovered area. However, a third party whose cultural achievements were passed on independently to Egypt and Mesopotamia would best explain the common features and fundamental differences between the two civilizations. So here you have a very established and reputable Egyptologist saying something's funny here. This civilization appeared out of nowhere. It appears to have influenced both Egypt and Mesopotamia at the same time. And there's the possibility of some third party. And this story also fits in very well with the story of Atlantis. Now, I'm not saying that this civilization that existed pre-Egypt was necessarily Atlantis, but There is a lot of reason to think that Plato wasn't lying when he said that Atlantis was real, and he was very adamant that it was real. Also, another interesting fact, Plato heard this story about Atlantis from an Egyptian scribe. So I'd like to give you one more quote from another Egyptologist, this time Sir Wallace Budge, who also noticed the similarity between Sin and Thoth, Sin being the Sumerian god of the moon and Thoth being the Egyptian god of the moon. And according to Wallace Budge, the similarity between the two gods is too close to be accidental. It would be wrong to say that the Egyptians borrowed from the Sumerians or the Sumerians from the Egyptians, but it may be submitted that the literature of both peoples borrowed their theological systems from some common but exceedingly ancient source. So here we have another Egyptologist who is noticing the similarities between the mythology of Egypt and Sumeria and saying that they're very related, but we don't think that either of them originated this mythology first. We think that there was some civilization that preceded it and passed it on to both of these civilizations, which is why they're so similar but slightly different. And another thing that these civilizations had in common was a common flood myth. Egypt had a flood myth. Sumeria had a great flood myth. If you'll remember our video on Gurdjieff, the magician, we talk about how Gurdjieff grows up and the tablet of Gilgamesh is discovered, and he reads that in a newspaper, and that leads him on his quest to find other ancient sources of information. Well, the tablet of Gilgamesh, also a flood myth, and as we'll come to see, Moses, the name Moses, actually means saved from water. That's a very interesting parallel. You have all these flood myths, and then you have someone like Moses who is saved from water, and water seems to be a very archetypical theme for Moses. Also, the story of Atlantis told by Plato is also a flood myth. So here you have the convergence of all these ancient flood myths, and perhaps they are telling the truth of an event that was experienced by all of these great civilizations. And the other thing to note as well is many of these countries also have a myth, like the Egyptians, who had the myth of Thoth and Osiris, who were the great civilizers that brought the teachings of civilization like laws and architecture and engineering and magic and things like that. They brought them to the civilizations. And Babylon, I believe, has a similar, Sumeria has a similar story. So you have all these similar stories of a great catastrophe and also civilizers coming in to teach the primitive civilization. And here's one more piece of evidence that points to the fact that there may have been an advanced previous civilization prior to Egypt. Gurdjieff used to talk about an inner esoteric chain of humanity. And this esoteric circle was a chain of wisdom that had been handed down from generation to generation and originated from Egypt, but not in the Egypt that we're familiar with, but in an Egypt before Egypt. And what he was saying is that there was a civilization before Egypt that united all religions. Gurdjieff was part of a very long oral tradition of different songs and stories that were passed down from generation to generation. And so Gurdjieff's father was sort of like the town bard, and he would go around doing songs and poems and different things in the village in Armenia where he grew up. And the people in Gurdjieff's family had been doing this for potentially thousands of years. So Gurdjieff grew up, and then eventually he comes across a newspaper article that reveals that they had found a tablet of the legend of Gilgamesh, which is a flood myth. And it was similar to Noah's Ark, that flood myth, but also a story that Gurdjieff's father had been passed down also corresponded with this myth. And so Gurdjieff, at this point, understands that there is potentially a lot of other wisdom that could have been handed down from generation to generation in different types of esoteric chains. So he goes and finds different mystery schools that have this type of old information. So all that to say, if anyone would know about esoteric chains of wisdom, it would be someone like Gurdjieff. And here's what he had to say. He was talking originally about the origins of Christianity, and I'm quoting, "Many people think that the outward form of worship, the rites, the singing of canticles, and so on, were invented by the fathers of the church. Others think that the outward form has been taken partly from pagan religions and partly from the Hebrews. But all of that is untrue. The question of the origin of the Christian church is much more interesting than we think. The Christian church, the Christian form of worship, was not invented by the fathers of the church. It was all taken in a ready-made form from Egypt, only not from the Egypt that we know, but from one which we do not know. This Egypt was in the same place as the other, but it existed much earlier. Only small bits of it survived in historical times, and these bits have been preserved in secret, and so well that we do not even know where they have been preserved. It will seem strange to many people when I say that prehistoric Egypt was Christian many thousands of years before the birth of Christ. That is to say, that its religion was composed of the same principles and ideas that constitute true Christianity. Special schools existed in this prehistoric Egypt, which were called schools of repetition. These schools were taken as a model for Christian churches. The form of worship in Christian churches almost entirely represents the course of repetition of the science dealing with the universe and man. Individual prayers, hymns, responses all had their own meanings in this repetition, as well as holidays and all religious symbols, though their meaning has been forgotten long ago." So that was Gurdjieff saying that there was a civilization pre-Egypt that passed on all of their spiritual and magical knowledge to Egypt. And in another book, Gurdjieff briefly mentions this civilization again and says that they divided up areas of schools into different branches or specializations of wisdom. And the way they did it was, in India, they set up a school of philosophy. In Egypt, they set up a school of theory. And in Persia, Mesopotamia, and Turkestan, that region, you had practice. So you had these three branches of schools: philosophy, practice, and theory. And so what Gurdjieff is saying here is that not only do the origins of Christianity point back to this ancient civilization pre-Egypt, but also the religions of India and all the other religions that were in that area, like Babylon and Sumeria and various places like that. All of them had a common ancestor in this ancient pre-Egyptian civilization. And the way that he said that this information was passed down was through these esoteric schools that either had oral traditions or had these secret societies that would initiate people into the mysteries and would pass down this information from generation to generation. Gurdjieff may have been ahead of his time because there's a lot of modern evidence now that shows that a prehistoric civilization is definitely possible, or perhaps even likely. One of the things we can look at is archaeological evidence. For example, there's water erosion on the Sphinx, which seems to indicate that it's probably several thousand years older than archaeologists estimate. It would have needed to have been in more of a rainy environment, which could only have put it sometime in the 4th or 5th century or beyond due to the amount of water erosion. So much like the boxes of Saqqara or the Great Pyramid, we don't really know how they would have been able to engineer the Sphinx with the tools that they had at the time. So if this ancient civilization and these ancient great civilizers actually existed in some form, then they would have passed on a great treasure trove of knowledge to the new civilization, which of course would have been kept by the pharaoh and the high priest. So how would Moses have learned all of this? Well, the obvious answer is he would have learned most of what he needed to know from Egypt itself. And so to understand Moses' power, we really need to understand Egypt and how powerful it was. And what I would like to suggest to you is that Egypt really did have a magic or technology that was different from our technology today, but was still an extremely advanced level of technology that in some cases our science still can't replicate. For example, the pyramids, particularly the Great Pyramid of Giza, shows an extraordinary level of precision in its construction. The stones are cut and fitted with such accuracy that the joints between them are often less than a millimeter wide. Some theories suggest that the copper tools used by the Egyptians would not have sufficed for such precision work on such hard stones, such as granite, leading to speculation about what methods and tools they did employ. And we still don't really know what those were, or even how they were used. And in fact, a couple decades ago, a Japanese team of engineers tried to build a 35-foot high replica of the Great Pyramid, which is a good bit smaller than the original, which was 481 feet tall. And the team started by limiting itself strictly to techniques proved by archaeology to have been used during the Fourth Dynasty. However, construction of the replica under these limitations turned out to be impossible, and in due course, they eventually resorted to using modern earth-moving quarrying and lifting machines. But still, even with the modern technology, they were not able to replicate even a smaller version of the Great Pyramid with modern tools. So it just goes to show you how difficult of a construction this was. And if a team of modern engineers couldn't do it with ancient tools or even modern tools, how did the Egyptians do it in the first place? And I don't have a good answer to that, but this is something that we have to think about. Perhaps they did actually have some type of magical science that was on par with our own, or even could surpass our own technology in certain ways. And that's something that the modern scientific mind has a very hard time admitting, that potentially an ancient civilization could have been more advanced than us in certain ways. But it is potentially true. A second thing to look at is the Dendera light. There's not exactly a ton of evidence for this, but just look at these pictures of the reliefs. And don't these pictures look like light bulbs? A lot of mainstream archaeology thinks that these are images of mythological or symbolic scenes, but it does look an awful lot like light bulbs. And then you compare that as well with something called the Baghdad Battery. And while this is not exactly Egyptian, it's in the relative area and time frame. It looks very similar to a battery. It suggests that the ancients might have had some rudimentary form of electrical technology. And one last thing I want to point out that points to the suggestion that there is some type of very advanced science going on in Egypt is the discovery of the tombs at Saqqara, which has puzzled archaeologists and researchers for a long time and has set up a very hot debate among many people involved. One of the amazing and mysterious things that they found in this labyrinth was 25 megalithic stone boxes weighing between 700 to 100 tons. And the builders of these boxes must have possessed an incredible amount of knowledge of geometry and mathematics and engineering in order to make these boxes. These boxes are made from rose granite, an extremely hard rock mined at a quarry about 800 kilometers away. And other boxes were made from an even harder material, diorite, found even further away. So number one, it would have been a chore to even get the stuff to the site. We're not sure how they would have even transported it to the site. Also, the precision of the boxes is another characteristic that left researchers baffled, because the deviations of the precision registers in the thousandths of an inch. That's extreme precision even for today. And also, given the extreme hardness of the rock, we really have no idea how they would have engineered this. Even with today's technology, it would probably take a laser to get such a fine precision. And yet here it is in Egypt, thousands of years old, with some type of unknown technology. And the other interesting thing about these megalithic boxes is a lot of modern day archaeologists think that these were essentially sarcophaguses for bulls who were these types of sacred bulls. But the problem with that theory is, number one, why were they put in such an extremely precise engineered box when a typical sarcophagus that you would put a pharaoh in isn't even that precise? And number two, the bulls weren't mummified. They just found some bull bones in one of the boxes and thought that, oh, well, this must have been where they buried the bulls. But why wouldn't they have mummified the bulls if this was truly a sacred burial for these bulls? So that theory doesn't make a ton of sense. One theory that I think is quite interesting to think about, and obviously a lot more research is needed, but some people think that this could have been an ancient technology of either a type of battery or a type of light system that would ionize the air surface around the city and create a glow. So essentially creating some city lights. And the way that this would work, there was a study on the effect of high pressure stress on granite material and luminescence that was analyzed in 2010. And in this study, a slab of granite was selected and stressed with high pressure to the point that light began to glow on the stone surface. The image below shows the experimental results from that study. As analyzed in the paper, granite under stress builds voltage potential on the surface. If the voltage is high enough, it ionizes the air around the surface, creating a glow. And also, over the century, there's also been numerous reports of what are called earthquake lights. When an earthquake happens, oftentimes these mysterious lights are seen in the sky. And the reason for this, they've discovered, is when the earth is moving below the surface and the granite and other rocks are rubbing on each other, it does actually create a luminescence that can light up the sky. And this has been reported many times over the years, people seeing it, and science has confirmed that this light effect does exist. And so these could have been lights where you put some organic material down in the box, and by putting organic material in the box, it will decompose in the box and build up gas, which will put pressure on the granite. And maybe that's why they were engineered so precisely, is that so that none of the gas could escape and that all the pressure would stay in the box. And then as the granite boxes experienced the stress, an electric charge would appear. The charges would be dispersed toward the ground surface above, and when the charges reach the surface, they ionize air pockets above the ground, and it would make light above the city. So that just gives you an idea of the type of esoteric knowledge that Moses could have learned and tapped into and expanded in his own way. We've also talked about how Moses was commonly compared to Thoth. And in fact, an entire work was created in the 2nd century BC by a philosopher named Artapanus, who compared Moses to Thoth and credited Moses with a wide range of remarkable inventions, including the inventions of ships and also different mechanical devices for water navigation, as well as credit for different social and civic innovations such as urban planning and the introduction of monotheism. And there were a very large range of other famous thinkers and scientists who were obsessed with Thoth and the Egyptian magic. For example, Copernicus credited his theory of a heliocentric universe to his study of the secret writings of the ancient Egyptians, including the hidden works of Thoth himself. The 17th century mathematician Kepler said that in formulating his laws of the planetary orbits, he was merely stealing the golden vessels of the Egyptians. Isaac Newton as well stated that his view was that the Egyptians concealed mysteries. Newton was obsessed with both Moses and the ancient Egyptians. He was steeped in the ancient Hermetic text as well as Egyptian alchemical literature. In fact, a tenth of his personal library was composed of alchemical treatises. Newton was drawn to the Old Testament and learned Hebrew to analyze the text properly. He became obsessed with the power of Moses, especially the Ark of the Covenant, which he thought was kind of a cryptogram of the universe, and by decoding it, he could see the mind of God. Another interesting divergent viewpoint of Newton's was that Jesus Christ was not, in fact, the Son of God, but an especially gifted man who was a great interpreter of God's master plan. And he viewed Moses in the same light. This would be pretty close to Gurdjieff's view on Jesus, again, as someone who had mastery over the transmutation of energy. Newton thought that Moses was an adept in the mysteries of the universe, and was also a master of alchemy in addition to being a prophet. He believed that Moses understood that matter consisted of atoms, and that gravity accrued to these atoms proportionally to the quantity of matter. He also thought that the account of Genesis, typically attributed to Moses, was an allegorical description of the alchemical process. Here's a quote from Newton. "Moses, that ancient theologue, describing and expressing ye most wonderful architecture of this great world, tells us that ye Spirit of God moved upon ye waters, which was an indigested chaos, or mass, created before by God. Just as the world was created from dark chaos through the bringing forth of the light, through the separation of the airy firmament, and of the waters from the earth, so our work brings forth the beginning out of black chaos, and its first matter through the separation of the elements, and the illumination of matter." So Newton was obsessed with this idea of Moses as a very powerful magician and architect of God's plan. And it makes sense why Newton was obsessed with Moses. Moses was a very archetypical character in the Bible. Again, we have the flood myth, and then we have someone like Moses who was saved from water, and his close proximity and myth to the character of Thoth as a god of knowledge and wisdom and magic certainly shine through here in the story with Moses. An interesting story. One of the Pharaoh's court astrologers essentially predicts that someone like Moses will be born, and that's what causes Pharaoh to try to kill all the Jewish sons in Egypt. And what's interesting, metaphorically, what you have here is a magician predicting another magician. But Moses miraculously escapes as the son of a Jewish person and ends up making it into the house of Pharaoh himself. And Moses is raised as one of Pharaoh's own. Presumably he was raised as a high priest or given the type of initiation that a king or prince would get in the courts of the Egyptian monarchy. So there's a good reason why Moses would have been heir to all of this knowledge that would have been passed down through the Egyptians in this esoteric chain. But as we'll see later in the story, that even though Moses learns all of the Egyptians' tricks, he's able to surpass them in terms of his overall skill, which is why he is able to ultimately free the Jewish people from the clutches of the Egyptians. It's also interesting that Newton's favorite Bible passage was, "And I will give thee the treasure of darkness, and hidden riches of secret places, that thou mayest know that I, the Lord, which call thee by name, am the God of Israel." So it's interesting that Newton was obsessed with these treasures of darkness and hidden riches, and he seemed to think that Moses was a master of these mysteries and had secrets that were given to man by God. In the mid-20th century, several of Newton's manuscripts, including his reconstruction of the floor plan of the Temple of Solomon that had been used to house Moses' Ark, went to auction and were purchased by famous economist John Maynard Keynes. Here's what Keynes said about Newton at the time. "He saw the whole universe as a riddle, as a secret which could be read by applying pure thought to certain evidence, certain mystic clues which God had hid about the world to allow a sort of philosopher's treasure hunt to the esoteric brotherhood. He believed that these clues were to be found partly in the evidence of the heavens and in the constitution of the elements, but also partly in certain papers and traditions handed down by the brethren in an unbroken chain back to the original cryptic revelation. So here we have another claim very similar to Gurdjieff's, that there is in fact an esoteric chain of knowledge being passed down from generation to generation, and that the great thinker Isaac Newton thought that it existed and that it came from Egypt. And Newton is not the only evidence we can see of such chains of esoteric wisdom coming from Egypt. For example, take a look at the history of Pythagoras. All accounts of Pythagoras agree that he traveled to Egypt to study with Egyptian priests, and the consensus is that he learned the foundations of geometry, math, and other things while studying in Egypt, becoming a priest and eventually forming his own school of wisdom, where his teachings were divided into esoteric and exoteric sections. The exoteric school, meaning the outer school, were taught life lessons, and the esoteric school, meaning the inner school, were initiated into the mysteries and were taught to observe a strict silence over everything they learned. And what we came to discover is that Pythagoras actually didn't invent the Pythagorean theorem, as there was a tablet that was found about 1,000 years before Pythagoras with the same formula. So he didn't invent it, but he certainly did popularize it. But the point being is that Pythagoras clearly learned a lot of his knowledge from the ancient Egyptians and used it to continue the esoteric chain of knowledge, which by now, since we've looked at several sources pointing to this, it seems pretty reasonable to assume that it really does exist. And there's a saying that sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And I would also turn that around and say any sufficiently advanced magic is indistinguishable from technology. And the Egyptians really didn't make much of a distinction between magic and technology. They were, in fact, many times one and the same. For example, in many of the Egyptian medical texts, there are various practical methods included, but at the same time, there were also spells which were included in the text on which deities to invoke for the particular illness. And magic in ancient Egypt was not a parlor trick or an illusion. It was the harnessing of the powers of natural laws, conceived of as a supernatural entity in order to achieve a certain goal. To the Egyptians, a world without magic was inconceivable. It was through magic that the world had been created. Magic sustained the world daily, gave when one had nothing, and assured one of eternal life after death. The Egyptologist James Henry Breasted has famously remarked how magic infused every aspect of Egyptian life and was as much a matter of course as sleep or preparation of food. Magic was present in one's conception, birth, life, death, and afterlife, and was represented by a god who was older than creation, Heka. Heka was the god of magic and the practice of the art itself. A magician priest or priest-physician would invoke Heka in the practice of Heka. The god was known as early as the pre-dynastic period, 6000 to 3150 BCE, developed during the early dynastic period, and appears in the pyramid text of the Old Kingdom and coffin text of the first immediate period. Heka never had a temple, cult following, or formal worship for a simple reason that he was so all-pervasive, he permeated every area of Egyptian life. Like the goddess Mat, who also never had a formal cult or temple, Heka was considered the underlying force of the visible and invisible world. Mat represented the central Egyptian value of balance and harmony, while Heka was the power which made balance, harmony, and every other concept or aspect of life possible. In the coffin text, Heka claims this primordial power, stating, "To me belonged the universe before you gods came into being. You have come afterwards because I am Heka." After creation, Heka sustained the world as the power which gave the gods all of their abilities. Even the gods feared him, and in the word of Egyptologist Richard H. Wilkinson, he was viewed as a god of inestimable power. This power was evident in one's daily life. The world operated as it did because of the gods, and the gods were able to perform their duties because of Heka. The priests of the temple cults understood this, but their function was to honor and care for their particular deity and ensure reciprocity between that god and the people. The priest or priestesses therefore would not invoke Heka directly because he was already present in the power of the deity that they served. Magic in religious practice took form of establishing what was already known about the gods and how the world worked. In the words of Egyptologist Jan Assmann, the rituals of the temple predominantly aimed at maintenance and sustainability. Egyptologist Margaret Bunsen clarifies, the main function of priests appeared to have remained constant. They kept the temple and sanctuary areas pure, conducted the cultic rituals and observances, and performed the great festive ceremonies for the public. In their roles of defenders of the faith, they were also expected to be able to display the power of their god against those of any other nation. A famous example of this is, of course, the book of Exodus, when Moses and Aaron confronted the Egyptian wise men and sorcerers. Which this is one of the most interesting passages in the Old Testament to me, because the Bible seems to confirm that the Egyptians had access to such magic in this passage as well. Recall, for example, the great plagues that Moses unleashes upon the Pharaoh's kingdom. The first few plagues, such as the staffs turning into snakes, turning water into blood, and the plague of frogs, the Egyptian court magicians were able to replicate, indicating that Moses could have learned these magics from Egypt and yet was able to surpass them in skill. I've analyzed this scenario through Kabbalistic magic, through a few different sources that had opinions on this scenario, and there seems to be a few different opinions as to what exactly happened with Moses and the high priest here in this passage of the Old Testament. One of the scenarios seems to lean towards thinking that the high priest could have matched Moses in his higher magic, but refused to do so because it was beneath them. And the second opinion seems to say that the reason that Moses's magic was superior to the Egyptians' magic is he was using magic of a higher degree and the Egyptians were using magic of a lower degree. And in the Kabbalistic tree of life here, so the higher magic that Moses was using was, according to the Kabbalistic perspective, associated with Metatron, which is the top node, Keter, whereas the Egyptian magic that they were using was more associated with Samael, or Samuel, which is the node right here. I think what was happening here was that Moses was calling on a higher degree of unity. He was calling on the one true God, whereas the Egyptians believed in a multitude of gods. And while there may be multiple aspects of God, if you're not calling on the very highest God, then your magic is not going to be as strong. And so you have the serpent above and the serpent below. And the Keter or Metatron node is the serpent above, which symbolizes higher spiritual forces and divine will. Metatron is a angel who is considered an archangel, second only to God, and he's associated with the highest levels of spiritual reality and sometimes seen as the celestial scribe or voice of God. Actually, interesting story about Metatron is, if you believe the Kabbalistic interpretation, Metatron is actually someone named Enoch, who is the great-grandfather of Noah. And Enoch lived to be 365 years old and never died. God just took him up into heaven, where he became a scribe and a mediator between God and the Nephilim. And then, according to the Kabbalistic literature, was actually transmuted into an archangel second only to God himself. And if that story is true, then you can see that Moses was actually calling upon his ancestor to help him reach his magical potential. So the Kabbalistic interpretation of the events in Egypt posits that the miracles performed by Moses and Aaron under God's command were not just demonstrations of power, but also allegorical representations of the triumph of higher spiritual realities over lower forms of magic. The transformation of the staff into a serpent and its victory over the serpents of the Egyptian magicians illustrates the concept that higher divine forces, the serpent above or Metatron, dominate and nullify the effects of lower material forces, the serpent below or Samuel. The narrative underscores a fundamental Kabbalistic theme, the ultimate superiority of divine will and the ineffable aspects of God over any form of magic or manipulation rooted in the material world. It emphasizes the importance of aligning oneself with the higher purpose of the divine, rather than being ensnared by the illusions and limitations of lower magic. And speaking of great magic, one of the greatest acts of magic that Moses is known for is when he parted the Red Sea. And there's an interesting story in something called the Westcar Papyrus, which was from around 1500 years before Moses, which tells the story of a pharaoh and a high priest who were on a boat on a lake with about 20 women. And one of the women drops some type of object into the lake and is very sad that they can't retrieve it. And so the pharaoh tells his high priest to utter some magic words, and the lake water splits in two, and they're able to go down to the bottom of the lake and retrieve the object. And then he says the magic words again, and the water goes back to normal. So here we have a story of magic that was done by the Egyptian high priest that could split the sea in two, and that is very similar to Moses' story of where he parted the Red Sea. So could Moses have learned the spell from the Egyptians? And I'd like to close here with one more quote from Egyptologist E.A. Wallace Budge. Moses was a skilled performer of magical rituals and was deeply learned in the knowledge of the accompanying spells, incantations, and magical formulas of every description. Moreover, the miracles which he wrought suggest he was not only a priest, but a magician of the highest order, and perhaps even a kerheb, or high priest. In fact, modern Egyptologists admit that there is likely a great body of esoteric wisdom of the kerheb, and it likely exists, but they have little idea of what it actually consisted of, as it was likely passed on in only oral form to initiates, and only obscure references to this body of work survive, mainly as inscriptions on the tombs of ancient great seers. For example, the inscription on the tomb of ancient pyramid architect Senmut mysteriously reads, "Having penetrated all the writings of the divine prophets, I was ignorant of nothing that has happened since the beginning of time." So, in wrapping up our exploration, it's evident that Moses stands among the most formidable magicians in history. His prowess rooted deeply in the teachings of what may well be the most spiritually advanced culture to have ever graced our planet, ancient Egypt, and perhaps even a civilization that predated it. This profound legacy, handed down through the ages, was not just preserved by the Egyptians, but was also bestowed upon Moses, enabling him to wield such unparalleled mystic power. As we reflect on this remarkable journey through history and spirituality, one can't help but marvel at the depth of wisdom and the mystical heritage that shaped Moses, transforming him into a figure whose legacy continues to inspire and captivate the imagination of seekers and scholars alike. And a keen observer may be thinking, we didn't talk about the Ark of the Covenant very much during this video. And you would be right. And that's because we plan on making another video that focuses more so on the Ark. This was an introductory video to give you the overview of the ancient civilization and Moses in general. But in the next video, we will be diving into the Ark of the Covenant and exploring its rich history and symbolism. So I hope you'll join us. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe to this video, and have a great day.